bourgeois economists, revealing the opposition between classes, considered this antithesis to be eternal and unshakable. Explaining the historical significance and, at the same time, the limited views of the classical economists, Marx wrote, "The last great representative of the English classical economy, Ricardo, after all consciously takes the point of his study as the starting point of his study, the antithesis of class interests, wages and profits, profit and land rent, considering this opposition as the natural law of social life." 8. French historians of the time of the Restoration depicted quite clearly the historical development of the class struggle. In the writings of Guizot, Thierry and Mignot, the class struggle is regarded as the basis of all political events. Thus, Guizot wrote, "The struggle of various classes of our society fills our history. The division of society into class Guizot associated with property relations. In order to understand political institutions, it is necessary to study the different layers existing in society, and their mutual relations. In order to understand these various social strata, one must know the nature of the land relations." Augustin Thierry was no less clearly aware of the class background of historical events. Thus, he depicts the history of the English Revolution as the struggle of the bourgeoisie against the aristocracy. Even religious movements of that era he regards as a manifestation of this class struggle. The war was fought on both sides for positive interests. Everything else was an appearance or an excuse. In Hegel's philosophy, the doctrine of the contradictory nature of development is formulated as a universal theoretical principle. Hegel taught that all things are contradictory in themselves, that contradiction is not something accidental, on the contrary, it is the principle of all self-movement. Contradiction is the root of all movement and vitality. Only because something has a contradiction in itself, it moves, has momentum and activity. But this doctrine of development through contradiction Hegel only turned to the past and stressed not that contradictions develop and develop, but on the contrary, he argued that contradictions in the course of development are smoothed out, neutralized, balanced. Similarly, modern Hegelians, not denying the contradictions of public life, tend to smooth them, reconcile each other. Moreover, Hegel, as an idealist, applied dialectics not to real life, but only to the development of concepts, to development in such a way called the absolute spirit. Hegel did not investigate the surrounding reality, he juggled with concepts, and concepts for him were primary elements, an absolute spirit, and matter is just their derivative, in which he is embodied. Hegel has a dialectic of concepts, and not the dialectic of nature. The entire course of world development acquired from Hegel a mystical character. The real world in Hegel's philosophy is derived from the concept, from the idea. Therefore, the very development of logical categories received a wrong, fantastic form in Hegel. Lenin pointed out that Hegel's logic cannot be applied in this form, cannot be taken as given. From it is necessary to choose logical shades, having cleared them of mysticism of ideas. Note RP, this is something that neophytes completely forget about, believing that Marxism can be studied by studying Hegel, which they are assiduously persuaded by some former Soviet professors who have become stale in their opportunism. Although Hegel's dialectic contained a rational grain that could be used, this dialectic was woven organically into a bourgeois worldview, into German ideology. It was not for nothing that Marx noted that the mystified dialectic of Hegel became a fashion in Germany, for in this form it glorified and sanctified the existing order. The reactionary bourgeois philosophers hate and reject revolutionary dialectics. Many of them cling to dialectics in its mystified form, for such dialectics always justifies oppression and exploitation, the injustice of peoples, all the abomination of the exploiting system. The mysterious dialectics of Hegel justified the superiority of the Germans over other peoples, justified wars, consecrated and praised the Prussian monarchic state, etc. In Hegel's philosophical system, development leads to the fact that the Prussian state is the pinnacle of progress, and the German people are the only one of its kind, elected people, which is called to rule over all nations. Mystified dialectics of Hegel argues that wars lead to the improvement of morals, that without war people are a standing marsh. That is why, rejecting revolutionary dialectics, the ideologists of the imperialist bourgeoisie picked up and inflated the mystifying side in Hegelian doctrine. It is no accident that Hegel's teaching was one of the philosophical roots of the man-hating German's fascism. Initially it required that an imperialist reaction desperately needed to strangle the revolutionary movement of the proletariat. Marx and Engels subjected to the ruthless criticism the reactionary side of Hegel's philosophy, cast aside Hegel's mysticism of ideas. The founders of Marxism-Leninism created and developed materialistic dialectics and applied the dialectical method to the analysis of the development of the real, material world, and, moreover, applied not only to past history, but to the present and future development of society. Marx and Engels rejected Hegel's teaching that development had ceased, and that all contradictions had been resolved through reconciliation. The fundamental difference between the method of Marx and Engels from the views of bourgeois philosophers, economists and historians was the doctrine of overcoming contradictions through the struggle of opposites. Marx and Engels sharply criticized the bourgeois doctrine of reconciliation and the peaceful harmonious coexistence of opposites. The most significant defect of Hegel's dialectics, Engels saw in that it does not pay due attention to overcoming contradictions. Criticizing Bentham, who attempted to reconcile common interest and private interest on the basis of private property, Engels wrote, "Bentham here does in his empiricism the same error as Hegel did in theory. He does not devote enough attention to overcoming contradictions, subordinates the subject to the predicate, the whole, to the part and thereby overturns everything with his head down." 9. True, Hegel taught that contradictions are resolved. But Hegel's resolution of contradictions is reduced to their reconciliation, merging. Hegel says that independent opposites remove themselves and turn themselves into their own. They dive into the base and merge with themselves in this immersion. Marx brilliantly showed how Hegel's reconciliation, balancing opposites. The thought, opposing itself, is divided into two thoughts, contradicting one another, to the position and the negation, to yes and no. The struggle of these two opposing elements consisting in the antithesis forms a dialectical movement. Yes, it turns into no, no it turns into yes, yes it becomes both yes and no, no it becomes simultaneously and no and yes. In this way the opposites are mutually balanced, neutralized and paralyzed. The fusion of these two thoughts, contradicting one another, forms a new thought, their synthesis. This new thought is again divided into two opposite thoughts, which, in turn, merge into a new synthesis. 10. Note: this is something that is often forgotten by those who are trying to master the dialectic of Marx while studying Hegel. The resolution of contradictions in Marxism, as is known, takes place in a different way. The doctrine of reconciliation, balancing the contradictions that Hegel pursued in the field of philosophy, bourgeois economists and historians persistently applied to public life. This is, incidentally, the main dogma not only of bourgeois ideologists, but also of the opportunists, guides of bourgeois ideas in the labor movement, who are increasingly expressing themselves as Marxist. Historians of the times of the Restoration recognized the fact of the division of society into class and in the struggle of class saw the foundation of all political history. But they did not even think about the possibility of destroying the classes. The division of society into classes they considered normal and unchanged condition. Bourgeois historians assured us that with the victory of the bourgeoisie over the aristocracy class antagonisms are resolved and the social world comes. The great master of the realistic depiction of Balzac's life with exceptional strength and vividness reflected the social contradictions of his era. He argued that these contradictions grow with a logical pattern. But Balzac made from this completely erroneous conclusion that no forces cannot destroy these contradictions. The reconciliation of contradictions, the preaching of political harmony, such, according to Balzac, is the guarantee of the well-being of society. Wherever you gather in a certain space several families of different wealth, you will observe how the higher circles, the patricians, the first, second and third classes of society are formed. Equality, perhaps, will someday be right, but no human power can convert it into a fact. It would be very useful for the prosperity of France to popularize this idea in it. For the least conscious masses, then all the benefits of political harmony will be revealed. Harmony is the poetry of order, and peoples have a living need for order. 11. It's very frank, is it? Just a singer of the bourgeoisie. Something in Russia about him has been forgotten, although they act directly on Balzac's orders. They are spreading among the working masses a false belief that under the bourgeois order, societal harmony is possible in classes. The petty bourgeois socialists did not go beyond the framework of the bourgeois worldview. For example, Proudhon, indignant over the contradictions of bourgeois life, did not even think about destroying the very source of all these contradictions, the exploitative system. Proudhon, as Marx said, sought to discover the correct equilibrium, the synthesis of two bourgeois thoughts. Proudhon condemned the contradictions, but not to destroy them, but to reconcile them. Criticizing these conciliatory tendencies, Marx wrote, wishing to reconcile contradictions, Proudhon does not even ask himself the question, should not the very basis of these contradictions be transformed? 12. Marx and Engels, applying dialectics to the analysis of living reality, have revealed a contradiction in the development of the very economic basis of society. They noticed that the productive forces in production relations are developing unevenly. While the productive forces are continuously growing, changing, the production relations for a more or less long time remain unchanged. At a certain stage of development, the productive forces come into collision with the production relations within which they previously developed. The contradiction between productive forces and production relations constitutes the deepest root of all social antagonisms, conflicts and clashes. Marx sharply criticized Proudhon for having substituted the analysis of actual contradictions with the statement of contradictions in his own head. To the place of the great historical movement arising from the conflict between the already acquired productive forces of people and their social relations that do not correspond more to these productive forces, to the place of terrible wars that are being prepared between different classes of one nation and between different nations, to the place of practical and the violent activity of the masses, which alone will be able to resolve these clashes, in the place of this vast, long and complex movement, Proudhon puts fanciful movements ahead. 13. In this polemical remark of Marx, 3 points should be specially emphasized. 1. The fundamental contradiction in the development of social life is the contradiction between the productive forces and the production relations that do not correspond to them. 2. This fundamental contradiction underlies conflicts and clashes between different social classes of one nation and between different nations. 3. Social contradictions can be resolved only by practical and violent activities of the masses. Marx and Engels showed that the contradictions inherent in bourgeois society are not eternal and irresistible, as bourgeois ideologists believed. Marx and Engels rebelled against the doctrine of neutralization and reconciliation of opposites, which prevailed in philosophy, political economy and in the historical science of that time. They for the first time proclaimed that it is only by an irreconcilable struggle that opposites can be eliminated. In applying to society, overcoming the sharpest and most acute contradictions means the abolition of classes. The struggle for the abolition of classes Marx and Engels considered the task of all their activities, the main goal of the working class movement. How ruthlessly Marx and Engels scorned the slogan of the equation of classes, which was preached by all sorts of bourgeois reformists. Criticizing the program of anarchists, Marx showed that the slogan of political, economic and social equation of classes contradicts the complete liberation of the working class. The equation of classes, understood literally, is reduced to the harmony of capital and labor, so intrusively preached by bourgeois socialists. Not equation classes, nonsense, in fact, unattainable, but on the contrary, the abolition of classes, that is the true secret of the proletarian movement, which is the great aim of the International Working Men's Association. 14. In the doctrine of the abolition of classes by bringing the class struggle to the dictatorship of the proletariat, Marx saw the main difference between his theory of the class struggle and all previous theories. This difference was most clearly formulated by Marx himself in a well-known letter to Whiting Mayer on March 5, 1852. Marx points out that he does not belong either to the merit of the discovery of classes in modern society, nor to the merit of the opening of the class struggle. Long before him, bourgeois historians expounded the historical development of the struggle between classes, and bourgeois economists, the economic anatomy of classes. And then, with the utmost clarity, Marx emphasized anew that he introduced into the understanding of the historical process. What I did new was to prove the following. 1. That the existence of classes is associated only with certain historical forms of development of production. 2. That the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. 3. That this dictatorship itself constitutes only a transition to the abolition of all class and to a classless society. In these provisions of Marx on the peculiarities of the Marxist understanding of the class struggle, the key is given to understanding the entire opposite of the Marxist dialectical method and the idealistic dialectic of Hegel. Unlike Hegel's doctrine of reconciling contradictions, the founders of Marxism-Leninism make the main emphasis on the struggle of opposites, on their overcoming and annihilation in the course of this struggle. That is why one cannot fail to see that sharp edge, the sharp contradiction that exists between the dialectic of Marxism and the dialectic of Hegel. To erase this line, to bring Marxist dialectics closer to the dialectic of Hegel, means to understand nothing in the extreme between the proletarian and bourgeois worldviews. In direct contrast to the dialectic of Hegel, the founders of Marxism-Leninism developed the ideas of materialistic dialectics, which expresses itself as a proletarian worldview. The Marxist dialectical method is a truly scientific reflection of the laws of the development of the material world, a generalization of the historical experience of the struggle of the popular masses for their liberation from exploitation and oppression. The founders of Marxism-Leninism first substantiated the proposition that contradictions in the development of society can and must be overcome through struggle. In the application to society, the destruction of contradictions is the destruction of classes, the destruction of the exploitation of man by man. The classics of Marxism-Leninism pointed out the way how to destroy the antagonism of class in society, the exploitation of one class by another. The doctrine of the contradictory nature of development, the struggle of opposites, was especially vividly confirmed in the era of imperialism. Never have social contradictions reached such an acuteness, never clashes and conflicts have not been as violent as under imperialism. The Marxist doctrine of overcoming contradictions through the struggle of opposites has therefore become particularly important. It is no accident that in the very epoch of imperialism, at the height of the First World Imperialist War, opposing the enemies of Marxism, Lenin repeatedly stressed the Marxist doctrine of the struggle of opposites in the most abrupt terms. Describing the dialectical understanding of development, Lenin wrote, "Development is a struggle of opposites." In contrast to metaphysics, which covers the reformist theory of blunting class contradictions, the theory of class collaboration, Lenin emphasizes the irreconcilability of mutually exclusive opposites, unity, coincidence, identity, equinox of opposites is conditional, temporary, transient, relational. The struggle of mutually exclusive opposites is absolute, as absolutely development, a movement. The peculiarities of Marxist dialectics are revealed with extraordinary clarity in Comrade Stalin's work on dialectical and historical materialism. Characterizing the opposite of metaphysics and dialectics, Comrade Stalin reveals the main features of the Marxist dialectical method. In contrast to metaphysics, dialectics treats things in phenomena not in their isolated state, but in their interconnection and conditioning, not as immutable, but as constantly evolving, where quantitative imperceptible changes ultimately lead to fundamental qualitative changes. Qualitative change does not occur gradually, but quickly, suddenly, in the form of a jump-like transition from one state to another. At the same time, Comrade Stalin emphasizes that development is carried out through contradictions. The struggle of opposites, the struggle of the old and the new, is the content of the development process. These features, which distinguish Marxist dialectics from metaphysics, at the same time distinguish Marxist-Leninist dialectics from the dialectic of Hegel. On the Marxist understanding of social development, Comrade Stalin writes, "If the world is in continuous movement and development, if the withering away of the old and the growth of the new is a law of development, then it is clear that there are no more unshakable social orders, eternal principles of private property and exploitation, eternal ideas of subordinating peasants to landlords, workers capitalists. Hence, the capitalist system can be replaced by the socialist system, just as the capitalist system replaced the feudal system in its time. This means that we must focus not on those layers of society that do not develop anymore, although they represent the prevailing force at the moment, and those that are developing have a future, although they do not represent the prevailing force at the moment." 15. Noting this feature in the application of dialectics to the practical activity of the party, Comrade Stalin says, "So, in order not to make a mistake in politics, we must look ahead, not backward." It is clear that this feature of Marxist dialectics is directly opposed to the spirit and aspirations of Hegel's dialectic. Comrade Stalin writes about the contradictory nature of development. If development proceeds in the order of revealing internal contradictions, in the order of clashes of opposing forces on the basis of these contradictions in order to overcome these contradictions, then it is clear that the class struggle of the proletariat is a completely natural and inevitable phenomenon. Hence, we must not cover up the contradictions of the capitalist systems, but open them up and uncoil them, not extinguish the class struggle, and bring it to the end. Hence, in order not to err in policy, one must pursue an uncompromising proletarian class policy, not a reformist policy of harmony of the interests of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, not a compromiser's policy of growing of capitalism into socialism. 16. It is clear that this feature of Marxist dialectics, is directly opposed to the spirit and meaning of Hegel's dialectic. The Bolshevik Party, the founders and leaders of it, Lenin and Stalin, are developing just such a revolutionary dialectic. The Marxist-Leninist understanding of dialectics, for which there is nothing once and for all given, established, eternal, irresistible, is an understanding that underlies the worldview of Marxism-Leninism. In all its activities to guide the workers' movement, in the restructuring of public life, our party has implemented and is implementing the basic principles of Marxist-Leninist dialectics, not to reconcile contradictions, not to hide them, but to unravel them and overcome them, to destroy them through open struggle. The revolution would never have won if the revolutionaries acted on the principle of the social democratic theory of reconciliation of contradictions, the theory of the growth of capitalism into socialism. The Bolshevik Party, from the very beginning of its birth, rejected these dogmas of social democracy, oriented the working masses to the elimination of contradictions by means of struggle, and not to cover them up and reconcile them. This way the party led the people to victory, to the creation of the Soviet system. The party itself developed and strengthened by overcoming contradictions. Comrade Stalin points out that overcoming inter-party contradictions through struggle is the law of the development of the party. Those parties that covered the inter-party contradictions, were decayed and perished. Note: RP killed into CPSU, when it began to cover up inter-party contradictions, which were nothing but class contradictions, contradictions between the revolution and the counter-revolution. Only the Bolshevik Party, boldly and mercilessly revealing the contradictions in the development of society, having broken all opportunist groups, became tempered and strengthened in the course of the struggle and now stands at the head of the most powerful state in the world. In the past, there were no examples that history was going on and life was built in accordance with the predestines of theorists and politicians. Political theories did not stand the test of life, because they did not have a scientific basis. Marxism-Leninism withstood the historical test and showed extraordinary strength and vitality in the course of social development. About 100 years have passed since the birth of Marxism. During this time, the destinies of Marx and Engels about the future, about the ways of the development of society were carried out and put into practice. The Marxist-Leninist Party is the force that directs social development. The history of our country went the way that was indicated by Lenin and Stalin. And for more than a quarter of a century the working people of our country, who have taken the destinies of the state into their own hands, are building their lives in strict accordance with the precepts of Lenin and Stalin. Marxist dialectics was for us a guide to action in peacetime. It is such a guide and now, in the conditions of war. The Great Patriotic War has again and again demonstrated the foresight and vitality of those conclusions that are based on the Marxist-Leninist dialectical method. For the dialectical method, Comrade Stalin says, what is important above all is not what seems strong at the moment, but begins to die away, but what arises and develops, even if it looks at the moment unstable, because for him it is irresistible only that which arises and develops. 17. The Patriotic War confirmed that it is invincible only that it grows and grows stronger. The state, whose strengths are growing in the course of the struggle, wins. On the contrary, a state whose forces are weakening in the course of the war inevitably suffers defeat. The change in the correlation of forces that occurred on the Soviet-German front, as vividly and convincingly demonstrates the correctness of this conclusion of Marxist-Leninist dialectics. Discovering the reasons for the defeat of the German troops on the Soviet-German front, Comrade Stalin said, the balance of forces on the Soviet-German front has changed. The fact is that fascist Germany is becoming more and more exhausted and weaker, and the Soviet Union is developing its reserves. More and more it is becoming stronger. This is the source of the victories of the Red Army and the cause of the defeats of the German fascist troops. The most acute contradiction in our time is the contradiction between the forces of progress united in the anti-Hitler coalition and the reactionary forces embodied by fascist Germany. There are, of course, such politicians who are thinking about whether these two camps, which are mortally hostile to each other, cannot be reconciled somehow. Our worldview does not recognize any reconciliation, no balancing, no peaceful coexistence of these hostile forces. Commentary: Khrushchev subsequently admitted, see his policy of peaceful coexistence. So they survived until they were completely disarmed before world imperialism, both ideologically and organizationally. The struggle to complete defeat, to the complete destruction of the Hitlerite state, Hitler's army, Hitler's new order in Europe, such are the interests of progressive humanity. This is the conclusion of our Marxist-Leninist worldview. The German troops, says Comrade Stalin, remind the wounded beast now, who is forced to crawl to the borders of his den, Germany, in order to heal the wounds. But the wounded beast who has gone to his den does not cease to be a dangerous beast. In order to save our country and allied countries from the danger of enslavement, it is necessary to pursue a wounded German beast at the heels and finish it in its own den. The Soviet people, brought up by the Bolshevik Party in the spirit of the Marxist-Leninist worldview, are determined to accelerate the defeat of the enemy, to bring the progressive people's victory over the reactionary forces of fascism, to ensure peace and freedom for all peoples. The journal, Bolshevik, 1944, number 9, pages 819.